2, verse 8 says, "For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast." Now back in verse 8 where it says, "By grace you're saved through faith." First of all, I should say that the word "saved" there means it could mean just God's work in our life, what God does for us. Are you okay? Okay. You get your drink of water?
Drop the hill.
Phil, could you run and get a drink for him? Okay, he'll take care of it. It says, "By grace are you saved through faith." The word "saved" there, you could read more into it than just what we usually do is we read it in a very narrow way, just meaning the fact that we became a Christian, our conversion, our being a Christian is what we call saved. But really, saved means, we could just say it in a general sense, rescued. Saved. When somebody's drowning, we mentioned this last week. When someone is drowning and the lifeguard jumps in the pool and saves them, he's rescued them. And really, this rescue or this saved, it means that it encompasses everything that God does, everything that He has, all the good things that come from God, that God supplies. It really is a kind of an umbrella term that means everything, not just narrowly the sense that I became a Christian and that's by grace. No, everything in the Christian life is by grace through faith. Notice that it says it's by grace, but it's also through faith. The grace is what God does. Grace is what God does for us all by Himself just because He's God. Grace is God's unmerited favor. Grace is, as He says here in this verse, you'll notice that He says, "By grace you're saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God." Meaning we don't do it, that is the rescuing or the saving. Just the word "saved" itself means that we can't do it ourselves. Someone else has to do it, and that's what the grace is. And frankly, just to be honest with you, it's important to focus on, and I generally do. I put much more emphasis on the grace side of it than when it says through faith. Faith is what we bring to it. Faith is our part. By grace is what God does, but faith is our response to it. And I think it's right to put most of the emphasis on grace because that's the most important thing. But it's also, we need to keep in mind the faith side of it. When he goes on and says, "Not of yourselves, it's the gift of God," that's just a way of amplifying and elaborating what grace is. And so what comes into our lives through heaven, through God, is by His grace. But a key factor is faith. Phil, could you give me the Message translation? I like what the Message says here. I think it gets it across very well. Listen to this: "Saving is all His idea, and it's all His work." Isn't that good? All His idea and all His work. All we do. Now here, if you want to define what the human element is, what the human part, what our part is in this relationship with God, here it is. All we do is trust Him enough to let Him do it. It's God's gift from start to finish. Give me the next verse, Phil. I like what it says too. Verse 9 in the Message. "We don't play the major role. If we did, we'd probably go around bragging that we'd done the whole thing." And how true that is, because people who think that what they do produces something from God, that's exactly what tends to happen. But notice what it says: we don't play the major role. Well, what our part is to believe, or faith. But notice that he says that's not the major role. That's not it's a secondary, it's a responsive part. See, God does everything. God does all the work. God does everything because we couldn't do it. We can't do it. We can't do the saving. We can't produce any of the things that we need that come to us from God. All we do is believe. All we do is put our faith in Him. Now, I say all we do, but that's important. But notice, first of all, notice what he says: we don't play the major role. It's a secondary part. It's a responsive part. But nevertheless, it's important. Now, let me try to put it in perspective by giving you a little story. Let's just say, now we'll use our imagination here. Now, again, don't get too excited because I'm just making up this story. But let's just say you got a check in the mail from some wealthy individual. Let's say Bill Gates. You know, he gives money away. Did you know that? He gives a lot of money away. And that's great. I think good for him. You know, I'm glad that wouldn't it be nice to have so much money you could just afford to just write checks everywhere. And That's nice. I'm not down on Bill Gates at all, and I appreciate his computers and all of his smarts and all of his company and everything. But let's just say you got a check in the mail. Who knows why? Let's just say you got a check for $1 million from Bill Gates. Wouldn't that be something? And what you have to think about for a moment is when you see a check for $1 million, what that represents. Think of the amount of labor and the amount of work and what would go into producing that kind of wealth, that kind of money. Somebody had to really work for that somewhere. It wasn't you because you just got the check in there, but somebody really put a lot of work into it. $1 million, that's a lot. Just think about in your own life, whatever you do for a living. I think about my life. How much work would that represent for me to accumulate $1 million? I can't even think of it. I can't even imagine this. So somebody worked, see. That check represents somebody's work, but not mine. Right? And really, when I got that check in the mail for $1 million, though, it really represents something really big and tremendous, really, fantastically tremendous that I didn't work for. Somebody worked for it. But really, truthfully, it's just a piece of paper. Right? You've seen checks before. It's just a piece of paper. But it represents something that I want to have. I want to be able to put that into action in my life. I want to see some reality. As long as it's just a piece of paper, it's not really doing much for me. Right? Though it makes me feel good. But the reason I feel good is because I know that it's going to produce the reality is what I'm thinking about. You all follow me so far? Now, in order for that piece of paper to produce, for me, things I need, helpful things. He evidently gave it to me because he knew I needed it. We could all say that, couldn't we? We can all say amen to that, yes, I could really use that, It represents, it's going to really be a blessing. But in order for that to be in my life in reality, there's something necessary that I've got to do. I've got a part to play, don't I? Right? So far it's just been Bill Gates. He worked for it. He produced it. You follow my story. He sent it to me. He wanted me to have it or he wouldn't have sent it, right? And it was delivered to me, See, that's what the preacher does. That's what I'm delivering, God's check for $1 million, so to speak, God's grace. But see, there's something necessary. It's such a small thing, but it's vitally important. Even if I could take that check down to the bank and I want the cash for it, you know what they're going to ask for? They're not just going to give it to me. I've got to endorse it on the back. You know that? When you go to the bank, you got to sign for it. See, that's such a small thing, but it's vitally important. Well, I liken that to what faith is. That's the part that faith plays in it. In the grand scheme of things, you might say it's a very small thing compared to the bigness of what God has done. But our faith is a vital and necessary element if we're going to experience the reality of it. Now, see, we could take that check and we could be really excited about it, and we could admire it, and we could even frame it, put it on the wall, and show our friends, that would be something. But as for me, rather than just something to be excited about, something to rejoice about, something to tell people about, I would rather just have the reality of it functioning in my life, wouldn't you? Right. But in order to do that, and you see in this story, it's necessary to endorse it, and that endorsement is like my participation. Now, granted, it's not much, but it's necessary. That says that I agree with it. When I sign to it, it says I agree that I received this, you see. And let me give you some examples. Look at Hebrews chapter 1 just for a second. Just to show you that, just to say it to you in Bible language. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1, another familiar verse. But just because these verses are familiar doesn't mean we can't read them again. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. Listen to this. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the reality or the evidence of things not seen. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now, what does it mean when it says faith? Now again, right now you understand we're talking about the human part. We're talking about our part. In that verse in Ephesians 2:8, we said, by grace you're saved, through faith, not of yourselves, it's the gift of God. Faith is the human part, it's our part. Now we're focusing just now right on the faith part. This is our part. It says, he tells us, it is the substance. Faith is the substance of things hoped for.